you may want to ask questions as the presentation is going on, rather than waiting until the Q&A section at the end, which is absolutely fine. We ask, please, that you put questions in the chat for this session. We will then be looking through the questions that come in, and we'll be synthesizing any similar questions so that we can make sure we get through as many of those as possible. So as and when you have any questions that you think of, please do feel free to share those in the chat. We also welcome you to share any other kind of personal reflections or comments that you might want to during listening to the presentation. Please just be, of course, mindful that the chat is shared with everybody, and please only post something that you feel comfortable sharing with people who are here today. And lastly, Teams has a captioning function that you will be able to turn on if you go to the options settings in Teams. So that is available as well, if that would help you to participate in the session. So moving on, just to do a very short little bit of an introduction before I pass over to my colleague Eleanor. Who's here today? We've got Darren Hunwicks here, who is the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Officer for Science and Engineering, and Eleanor McDavis, EDI Manager for leading the LGBTQA+ inclusion and staff disability inclusion portfolios, in which Darren also works on that portfolio as well. Myself, my name is Liz Grand, and I'm another one of the EDI managers in the team, and I lead the gender equality portfolio. And of course, we have our fantastic speaker today, Elizabeth Quinn. And Elizabeth is a psychology PhD student at Queen Mary, currently writing up her thesis. She'll talk much more about this, I'm sure, but just as an introduction, she was diagnosed with ADHD in her second year of her PhD, and she'll be talking about the experiences of neurodivergent women and girls in this specific talk. So just to say a little bit about the importance of this talk, really, and the importance of intersectionality and the approach that us as an EDI team are really happy to showcase today. This event has come about through a coordinated approach and an intersectional approach, where we are today, through this event, recognising and celebrating both International Women's Day, which happened last week on the 8th of March, and also Neurodiversity Celebration Week, which is happening this week. And we really wanted to take the opportunity to actually think about both of these awareness days and the intersectionality between both, specifically looking at gender and neurodiversity in this talk. And this really reflects the approach that we take as an EDI team at Queen Mary. We aim to be intersectional by default in the work that we do and in the way that we do our work. This includes regularly communicating and identifying crossover and intersections across the different portfolios and areas of work that we manage within the team. So we're really pleased and excited to see an event today that demonstrates the importance of considering and understanding intersectionality so well. And just to say, we've got a range of events taking place to mark both International Women's Day, happening throughout March, and also events to mark and celebrate Neurodiversity Celebration Week. And we will share with you the links to the event retrospective event programmes for those, so that you can have a look at what else is going on throughout the month. If there are any events that you're aware of that link to these dates, or you're interested in taking part in a spotlight profile, please do contact myself or my colleague Eleanor, and we will pick up with you in terms of featuring those in relation to these different dates. So I'm going to stop talking now and hand over to my colleague Eleanor, who's going to say a little bit more about neurodiversity.
Thanks very much, Liz, and yeah, thank you to everyone who's managed to join us today for this Lunch and Learn. Before we start looking at the specific topic of the experiences of neurodivergent women and girls, and not wanting to overlap on content too much, but we wanted to give a bit of an overview about what do we mean by neurodiversity or neurodivergent. As these are phrases that you may have heard, but may not have a huge amount of understanding of before. So at Queen Mary, we follow a social model of disability, and the social model of disability basically recognises the social model of disability basically recognises that it is society and the parameters rather than disabled people's experiences that cause disability. So that disability is a function of society rather than something inherent to individuals. And grounded within this concept is the concept of neurodiversity is grounded within this model. And the model of neurodiversity was originally coined by an Australian sociologist called Judith Singer in 1998, who basically took an opposing view to the one that was predominant at the time, that viewed people as suffering from dysfunctions, diseases in their mental processing, and using terms around disorder, and shifted it to speaking about differences in cognitive functions, basically saying that no brain is the same. However, what we do know is that the majority of people have their brain functions and processes information in a way that society expects, which is basically referring back to that social model of disability. It's grounded in the social expectations rather than the ability of the individuals. So what we know is that about 1 in 7 people brains do not function or process information in the way that society expects it to. What this has led to is the development of a number of different learning differences, many which have overlapping existences. So neurodivergent is a term that is that umbrella term, and here you can see a number of those neurodivergent learning differences. This is absolutely not an exhaustive list of what it means to be neurodiverse, but they are some of the more predominant learning differences that people may experience or may have a diagnosis of. And what you can see actually is there is significant overlap throughout them all. Next slide, please, Dan. And one of the really important things about the concept of neurodiversity and why marking Neurodiversity Celebration Week matters is because it moves from shifting the language shifting language from a negative one to a more positive one, thinking about not just the challenges that neurodivergent people face, but recognizing the determination that individuals have in recognizing the determination that people have in facing the challenges they may face on an everyday basis, but also highlighting and celebrating the strengths and talents of neurodivergent people, and the talents of neurodivergent people, and that's part of the reason why we wanted to be celebrating Neurodiversity Celebration Week this year, and bring to life some of the lived experiences of people within our community to highlight their successes, their strengths, their talents. And I will pause there because I don't want to start encroaching on some of Elizabeth's content, as I know she's going to be particularly speaking to those lived experiences and differences that may come through. So Elizabeth, if I could hand over to you now.
Hi, yes, thank you. Thanks, Eleanor, and thanks everyone for coming and joining me for the talk today. I'm really, really excited to be here to talk to you about neurodiversity or neurodivergence in women and girls. Before I do start, I wanted to say that this talk is built upon my experience. So I was diagnosed with ADHD around 2 years ago at the age of 34. And so my experiences plus those of friends and colleagues and people I've spoken to since then. Also extensive reading and research that I've done. And I'm focusing my talk today on ADHD and autism in women and girls. Obviously, there are many other neurodivergent conditions as well, as Eleanor was mentioning, but this talk's focusing on ADHD and autism. And also I've done lots of reading of memoirs and I don't know, just anything that I can over the years to really try to understand what's been going on with ADHD and autism in women and girls, seeing as I had this sort of experience that many women have of a late diagnosis of not being picked up as a child. So just to start off with, as I say, I'm going to focus on ADHD and autism. I don't want to kind of spend too much time on the in-depths of what ADHD and autism are, because I want this to be about the experiences of people, of women and girls, and to talk about kind of what it's like. But I just want to go through perhaps what might be known as the classic definitions or presentations of ADHD and autism. I want to make sure, again, these are two different conditions. They're separate conditions. They have different presentations. They have different behaviors associated with them, different traits. So ADHD is particularly sort of conceptualized around differences in attention. So that might be staying focused or concentrating, being easily distracted or forgetful, differences in hyperactivity. So not being able to sit still, running around, climbing things as children, perhaps, talking too much, something that you will notice I do as we go through this talk. And I should put too much in inverted commas, but we'll talk about that as well. Differences in impulsivity, so that might be interrupting people. It might be sort of not thinking through the consequences of actions, but acting first and sort of thinking later. And autism, which is kind of classically conceptualized around differences in communication. So that might be trouble with verbal or non-verbal communication, not making eye contact, finding it difficult to express yourself. Some people with autism or some autistic people are non-verbal. So they might not communicate through the spoken word at all. But others, they do communicate through the spoken word, but might find that more difficult, might find it more difficult understanding the perspective of other people. Differences in social interactions, so difficulties maybe understanding social cues, differences in making friends. I mean, I'm trying to do the classic interpretation of these or the classic presentation, but even now I just keep wanting to say, you know, even with making friends, often when talking to autistic people, making friends isn't always the difficulty, but maintaining friendships or sustaining friendships may be more difficult. Also repetitive behaviors, so that might be things like stimming, so kind of self-soothing behaviors, so that might be rocking or spinning or hand flapping. Difficulties with change, having strong intense interests. So the very, very sort of classic stereotypical example is sort of perhaps a boy having an intense interest in train timetables or lining up objects, maybe children lining up their toys rather than playing with them in what might be considered a more typical way. But although these are different conditions, there is considerable overlap as well in terms of some of the experiences and also some of the behaviors as well. And again, whether that is due to the traits being the same or similar, or whether that is due to the presentation of them being similar for different reasons, is probably the subject for a different talk. These conditions also co-occur quite a lot. I think if an autistic person is about 70% likely to also have ADHD or to be to have the sort of clinical levels of ADHD symptoms. I think if you have ADHD, it's about 30% likely that you will also have autism. So just to start us off, I'm going to, dashing ahead. The first sort of section I want to talk about, I've labeled misdiagnosis. I've put it like this because women and girls are often missed entirely in being diagnosed. We'll talk about that in a second. But they're also misdiagnosed with other conditions rather than neurodevelopmental ones. And by the way, just to let you know, I really hate creating PowerPoint presentations. And as this is Neurodiversity Celebration Week, I've decided to do them as I feel like my brain looks. So you'll have to get on board with my strange PowerPoint presentations. So basically, the first thing to say here is that women, their symptoms present differently to the way that men and boys symptoms present in both ADHD and girls. And this is a very typical thing we've seen a lot recently in healthcare in general, isn't it? Like women it's been assumed that the symptoms that have been, researched around men must be the same for women. I think one classic example recently is they've discovered women have quite different symptoms when they're having a heart attack than men, which we didn't know until recently. But it was researched on men. Therefore this is what a heart attack looks like. That's very much happened in the diagnosis of neurodivergent conditions. And the classic presentations that I sort of described to you at the beginning, they are built around how these conditions present in men and in boys. And so women have kind of gone under the radar until quite recently. I believe the ratio that people thought there was between men and women in autism was 10 men to 1 woman, or 10 boys to 1 girl. And the 1 girl would have what would be considered very extreme presentation, very noticeable. But actually, the way that women's symptoms typically present is much less noticeable. So with ADHD, women and girls are much more likely to have inattentive symptoms. So they're more likely to have symptoms where they're struggling to focus, to concentrate, more distracted, forgetful, losing things, and less likely to be outwardly hyperactive. So they're less likely to be the kid in the classroom that's climbing the walls or drawing attention to themselves. So they don't get noticed in that way. And hyperactivity in women is more likely to be internalized. So again, that kind of can come out with, I'll put excessive talking. You'll see I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder about this as we go through the talk. And racing thoughts, anxiety, things like that. But it's not as noticeable as a child who cannot stay in their seat or cannot climb the wall in school. I mean, when I was a child at school, I don't begrudge not being diagnosed when I was at school, because no one was looking for ADHD in women and girls when I was at school. It just wasn't done. I think things are changing now, but people just didn't think that girls and women really got ADHD. So women are often less visible as children, and then that kind of comes through into adults as well. Girls and women are much more likely to mask or camouflage their symptoms, both in ADHD and autism. I'm going to talk much more about masking and camouflaging in a later slide. But essentially, this is where people sort of conceal certain traits and then replace them, or kind of sort of replace them with more neurotypical ones to avoid being recognized or noticed or found out that they are different. I think that I always used to say that the ADHD is kind of in women is there's so much that's relevant to feminism and to gender norms. I think where men sometimes, and again, I don't want to be too kind of stereotypical against men, but where men are sometimes given a pass that women aren't. So I think that women, when they're having difficulties, they're often labelled either as being scatterbrained. This was very much me at school. I was a very scatterbrained chatterbox. In my year 4 class, I was everyone sat in pairs, and my teacher decided I talked too much to the person I was sitting next to, and so she made me sit on a desk on my own right at the back of the class, like against the back wall, and I sat there for the rest of the year on my own. And you know, I things like that sort of carried on into my adult life. So I moved into psychology later on in life. I did a graduate diploma, and during one of my courses there, I was always the kid that sort of sat with their hand up and answered every question. When I've talked to neurodivergent people, they've often said that they were always either that kid or that person that's always answering every question, or completely silent and just keeping their head down and not saying anything. And I was the same at university, and I was very excited to be back at university and learning. And I often would have these sort of conversations with the teacher. You know, he was talking, or we would engage in something. And then at the break in one of my classes, I was approached by another of the students, and it turned out that she'd been sent by most of the rest of the class to ask me to stop talking so much and to stop asking questions, and to just so everyone could get on with the class. I remember thinking at the time, you know, I'm 30. I was like, hang on, I'm 30. Like, what's happening? Why is this still happening to me? So you can see why I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder about that. But I think, you know, girls get sort of pegged as dreamy or different. When girls are having autistic meltdowns, I think as well, they're judged quite harshly. You know, why can't you just get it together? Why are you being so difficult? You're so difficult. And also, I think, whereas perhaps if a boy was having a meltdown, it might be looked into a bit more. And maybe I'm being unfair there, but I think that, you know, a lot of people have said that, you know, my brother was paid attention to when this happened, and I was told to just get it together. And organization and managing the household, this is another of the chips on my shoulder, I have to say, because I think that we do internalize a lot of social gender norms as women. I think we whether we think it's right or not, I think that we sort of internalize how we're supposed to be, and women are often meant to be the managers, the organizers. Like, if a man is disorganized at work or at home, it's sort of often, oh, you know, almost babified, maybe, like, oh, he just needs someone to look after him. But women are expected to do these things. So my house is always a mess. There's a reason why my background is blurred always, because I don't want anyone to see what's going on behind me in my house. You know, no one ever gets a Christmas card or a birthday card from me. Not because I've moved that, sorry. Not because I'm not wanting to send them, but it just does not happen. So yeah, we will move on, I think. Oh no, I just want to do this last bit here. The misdiagnosis, the mental health. This is really important. So let me just talk about this before I move on. So another thing that does happen with women is that they are often misdiagnosed. So you might recognize there's a problem, and most people with a neurodivergent condition, ADHD or autism, have a co-occurring mental health condition, but they often will go and be diagnosed with depression, or maybe bipolar or borderline personality disorder. These are conditions that women typically get diagnosed with more than men, I think. And that's not to say that the women may not have these conditions, but often things don't go any further than that. You know, it's that's what's wrong with you. And then the treatments don't necessarily work very well. It's labeled as treatment resistant, whereas actually there's an underlying problem. So I want to talk a bit more about the masking and camouflage as well that I mentioned, because women are statistically more likely to engage in masking and camouflaging activity, which is another reason why they often get missed or sort of not picked out. Social camouflaging, I think, is particularly associated with autistic women, but I do think as well relevant for ADHD women, too sometimes, and this is often where women might, and girls, they might look at other people and they find ways of copying typical behaviors because they're aware that they're not able to kind of figure their way through like social interactions. They don't really understand what's going on. And one way that women and girls often really do this is through different forms of media. So they might study behavior from books. Jennifer Cook O'Toole, I think I mentioned her already, she wrote Autism in Heels. She talks a lot about this. She talks about studying behavior from autobiographies. She used to read autobiographies to understand how people interacted with each other. From practicing conversations that might have been scripted from books or TVs and films, and practicing conversations and facial expressions in advance of then going and actually having to have those in reality. Forcing yourself to make eye contact or finding ways to make eye contact. So it might be that you learn to look sort of between someone's eyes, almost like in their forehead, or sort of learn that you can sort of briefly look at someone's eyes and then sort of look away while you're talking, because I look like I'm thinking about what I'm talking about, and then I might look back briefly and make eye contact again. So finding ways to kind of make eye contact rather than just not making eye contact. And I think women and girls are more likely to find tools like this to kind of blend in. Masking differences, so that's sort of where you might just force yourself not to engage in behaviors that might seem untypical. So that could be suppressing stims, stopping fidgeting, so forcing your body to stay still. So I always need to be bouncing, like, oh, sorry, you're going to hear my Alexa telling me to take my ADHD medication. Ignore that for a second. Yeah, so I often need to fidget, and when you make yourself stop fidgeting, your whole body is screaming at you that it needs to move. But so it takes a lot of energy to do these things, and that's something that women find it takes a lot of energy. It's exhausting to mask constantly and to do these camouflaging behaviors. So you might avoid social situations altogether, especially if you know you've not got the energy to do it right now. And then masking struggles. So one of the things that ADHD and autism have in common is that there's an awful lot of executive dysfunction. A lot of the time your brain doesn't work in the same way as others. That can cause a lot of difficulties, maybe in work and in school. And so you might find ways to kind of get around this. So you might find extra time to complete those tasks or work. So that's really, really typical. When I was getting diagnosed, my psychiatrist talked to me about when he was an expert in diagnosing women in later life, and he would talk to me about when women come to him, often it's at a point where something's happened, and these extra times or these extra tools that women have to enable them to kind of get through their lives have stopped working. So an example of this might be that you've got a job, you're doing well, but you struggle to work during typical working hours at the office because everyone's talking and it's very distracting. So you often stay late at the office to try to do your work later, or you take your work home and you do it with you at home. But then you might enter into a relationship, and your partner now is expecting to have that evening time with you. So you don't have that time to dedicate to your work the way you did. And suddenly you're starting to struggle at work. You're getting into trouble. You're not getting your work done. And things start to fall apart. So he would say to me, it often was at different stages, but it might be something like getting a promotion or having a baby or having something extra comes in, and all of these things that you've been using to kind of get through, all of these plates you've been spinning, suddenly everything falls apart. And women often come and find a diagnosis later in life when everything has fallen apart, and they're in real trouble. Not letting people come to your home, that's what I do again, like when it's really messy, so you just think, I'm just not going to invite anybody over. And not asking for help. I used to ask for help so often, it became so embarrassing, I just stopped. And I would just, if I didn't know something, I'd go and spend extra time looking for it, looking for what I needed. So the next section I want to talk about is sensory differences. Now, I want to say as well that all of these, you're more statistically likely to have these if you are neurodivergent, but you don't have to be neurodivergent to have any of these. So this is just that you're more likely to. And women with ADHD and autism are both more likely to be hypersensitive. And hypersensitivity, it's actually connected with sensory avoidance because you're more sensitive to sort of sensory phenomena. So it might be loud sounds. I'm quite sensory to sounds. I have misophonia. I don't know if any of you have misophonia, or if any of you, a good example of that is if you get literally like unbelievably rageful and angry at the sound of somebody chewing loudly, for example. It's often associated with mouth noises, and I get it really badly with snoring. My poor husband genuinely like sleeps in fear because I get homicidal and he does snore. The other day, actually, he woke up and I swear I was trying to build like a little sound fort in pillows around him. But he just found me like sitting over him holding a pillow, and he was like, "Oh my God, it's happening! It's finally snapped." I was like, "No, I promise. I was just building a fort." Probably too much information for you there, but there we go. It really just a complete stranger snoring on a train, and I have to really repress my homicidal tendencies, just the noise. But also things like being hypersensitive to clothes labels, sort of stabbing, feeling like being stabbed, smells. It can be completely overwhelming. And sometimes when you see autistic children having sort of a meltdown, it can be because they're being so overwhelmed. The brain doesn't filter out all of these different sensory things to the extent that they do in a typical person. So getting completely overwhelmed. But hyposensitive, as I say, it's less common in women, but it's still something that is probably associated more with the more typical or the more stereotypical idea of autism, actually, where you are sensory seeking. You're not getting enough stimulation, so you want loud noises. Children might do spinning. They might spin round and round and round because they're loving the sensation. And they might actually hurt themselves even because they're staring at bright lights or listening to very, very loud noises. Women are more likely to have synesthesia in general, but neurodivergent women, much more likely to have synesthesia. This is any kind of blending of senses. The most common one is, a color for a day of the week, colors for days of the week, so colors for numbers and letters. My father has it. He sees numbers on a line, so like the numbers go along, and then at a certain number it goes up, and then along, and then down. And then aphantasia I put on there because this is what I have. Not all synesthesias are pleasant, but to me they sound really cool. Whereas I am completely non-visual. I can't visualize anything. So which I find much less exciting, but you can have sort of the opposite of that as well. I'm going to go on to challenges. There's quite a few challenges here. I'm just keeping aware of the time, so I think I might go 5 minutes over. But challenges, there's quite a lot when it comes to having ADHD or autism. I mentioned mental health already. I think it's women are much more likely to have a co-occurring mental health condition with autism and ADHD. Skin picking as well. Eating disorders, now that's a really big one with women and neurodivergence. Bulimia and binge eating disorder, probably more associated with ADHD. Anorexia, extremely associated with autism. In fact, they say that they think 25% of girls with anorexia are autistic. So that's a big red flag there as well. Substance abuse, this can go along because, again, finding ways to self-soothe, but also linked with ADHD because ADHD involves a lack of dopamine, so needing that stimulation, and also troubles with impulsivity. Criminal justice system. So this shocked me when I found out about it. 25. So adults, the ADHD prevalence in adults in the UK is about 3%. 25% of prisoners have ADHD or clinically reach the criteria for ADHD. And I read a recent article about where they looked in a women's prison, and they reckoned it was as much as 40%. There. So that's interesting. And again, not because people with ADHD are inherently bad people. It always reminds me, when I was diagnosed with ADHD, my father-in-law was he's a retired police officer, and the first thing he said to me was, well, "Why aren't you in prison?" Which probably goes to show the sort of training that he was given around ADHD back in the 90s. Now, it's also a link to abuse as well. People who are neurodivergent and neurodivergent women are more likely to suffer bullying. I certainly did at school. More likely to suffer intimate partner violence as well. I put oversharing here because oversharing, again, whether that's through talking a lot or whether that's through sort of not necessarily knowing boundaries or being aware of boundaries, but you can share sort of material stuff about that. It's dangerous really to share without realizing it to people who shouldn't necessarily know about it. I've talked about executive dysfunction, struggling at school. This can lead to or underemployment, more likely to being financially reliant on parents. And at the top there, I missed out early death. So I think it's something like 13, you're likely to die 13 years earlier. If you have either ADHD or autism. I've read that. And then something that really does go very much with women is that there seems to be some real overlap with sort of hormonal, with hormones and ADHD and autism. So lots of people feel that their difficulties are much more so during their menstrual cycle. And also women often get diagnosed around sort of these hormonal milestones, so like at puberty or at the menopause. I've been reading quite a lot about ADHD and the menopause recently, and women often say that's the worst time in their lives for the challenges of ADHD is during the menopause, because I think that the difficulties of the menopause and then ADHD, that sometimes when I read, sometimes when I read about menopausal symptoms, they sound quite like ADHD symptoms to me. So I think it's sort of just made that much worse. But also I wanted to talk about the benefits. So I think this is really important to talk about. There are lots of really good things about being neurodivergent. Neurodivergent people are often really good at pattern recognition. I also wanted to kind of go underneath what some of this means, like, and what women and girls will talk about. So a lot of women and girls, especially with autism, I've read a real strong connection to poetry and song lyrics, and they see patterns in the music and patterns in the poetry and song lyrics, and they're often really good poets as well. And a keen interest in word and phrase origins. Obviously also related to pattern recognition, mathematical and technical ability. I think things like coding and computer programming. People know that often autistic people are really strong at that, and lots of my cousin, she's neurodivergent and she's really into computer games. I think there's a lot of links with sort of people loving computer games and working in the computer game industry as well. Really good at problem solving. So I think that's something with ADHD, a lot of people are very quick at putting things together, at seeing problems, at troubleshooting. One of the absolute, it's not, I always quite useless, but one of the skills that I feel that I have that doesn't really help in any way in the real world is that I always solve murder mysteries. And I always get plot twists before anybody else. It's often infuriating for people watching films with me. It doesn't help me much in my day-to-day life, but I still feel proud of that. I can usually solve it. You've got to take what you can get, haven't you? Often people with ADHD and autism are really creative. I've read an article about how many comedians have ADHD, and I'm like, yeah, of course, that makes perfect sense to me. First of all, you have got to like think laterally, you've got to be quick, you've got to quick respond. But also, you know, we have a lifetime of class clowning our way through things, because, you know, we like distract with humor. You know, someone's come and told you, oh, you talk too much at the age of 30, please can you be quiet, so the rest of us can just, you know, and you have to think, shall this be a horribly distressing thing for the rest of my life, or shall I make a joke out of it? So I think that that comedians, that makes a lot of sense to me, great artists as well, good advocates, and a strong sense of fairness and justice. So both people with autism or autistic people and ADHDers have really strong sense of fairness and justice, and they fight for what they think is fair. They fight for what they believe to be right, and I think that's a great trait that we all have. Special interests, one of my favorite things. We're experts in things, right? We're experts. When I was a kid, I had lots of special interests, one of which was the James Bond films, and we went to an exhibition with all the cars and the gadgets of the James Bond, and we went round, and I answered every question, every single one. By the end of the thing, again, like insufferable know-it-all was probably what many people thought, but you know, I knew where every single one had come from, which Bond film, what it was for. So they say that that neurodivergent people often have interest-based nervous systems. This is another thing. It's like this this idea that with ADHD you can't pay attention. That's not true at all. We're very good at paying attention to what we're interested in. We lack the control to change our attention, especially to things that we're not interested in, whereas other people are often able to do that. So there's lots of really great things about being neurodivergent as well, and I think that, you know, as things are changing, hopefully we'll be able to create a better world where we're able to sort of fit in a bit better. Anyway, that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening. I shall hand back over now.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was absolutely brilliant, and yeah, for ending on the benefits as well. Obviously, this is Neurodiversity Celebration Week, so it's really great to finish on the slides there that you went through, and thank you for sharing so openly and personally as well about your own experiences. Just a couple of quick slides from me before we move on to the discussion session, and we'll stop the recording. But there may be a number of different reasons why people have come along today to the talk out of interest. And I know some of the discussion in the chat has been around what people can do. So I just wanted to very briefly just touch on allyship. And by coming along to the talk today, you are supporting Neurodiversity Celebration Week. But some of the things you can do practically to support neurodivergent people and to celebrate neurodiversity are recognising and acknowledging that everyone has a differently wired brain, and everyone has their own unique way of thinking, interacting and experiencing the world. So that recognition first. And then, as we have been just discussing in the last couple of slides, communicating and celebrating the benefits of neurodiversity is really important. You can find out more about the lived experiences of neurodivergent people, and you can have a look at the Neurodiversity Celebration Week web pages, where we'll be posting some recommendations and links there. And you can also consider and ask how ways of working can be most inclusive and efficient for others. So that's whether you are a manager, whether you're working with colleagues, that's certainly something that you can consider. We will be sharing the recording of this session with colleagues who were unable to attend, so keep an eye out for that. And again, you can share that and encourage people to watch the excellent talk and to listen to Elizabeth's fantastic presentation. Neurodiversity Celebration Week, the organisers have their own fantastic calendar of events, so I'll post the link in the chat. And if you are looking to speak to others, you're looking for some support or networking, if you're a staff member, you can join the Staff Disability Network. And if you are a student, there is the Queen Mary Student Union Neurodivergent Society that you can take a look out and consider contacting. We are also really keen to hear your thoughts and feedback. So Eleanor, I don't know if you want to take over this slide here, and then I'll stop the recording.
Thanks, Darren. Yeah, as Darren said, we are looking to collect your thoughts and feedbacks, both about Neurodiversity Celebration Week, but also about going much beyond this as a singular point in the year,